what is the expectation of, on your side, with regard to the U.S. coming in with B-2 bombers and actually destroying the capacity at Fort Howe? And I don't know if Natanz is still extant, but it sounds like that there really is not. There's no limits on your side that you own or that you can wield on your own that can accomplish the complete destruction of the most hardened centrifuges.
That is what everybody knows.
Mm.
And technically on paper that is absolutely the case. And there was absolutely no way for Israel to sidestep the Radwan force of Hezbollah and just dismantle Hezbollah as a strategic mobilizable force without fighting the most hardened fighters. Hundreds of casualties at least from the Israeli military. And then they did. Does the Mossad have something up its sleeve? We know that this whole strategy of taking over supply chains has already been done vis-a-vis the Iranian nuclear program. At one point, I remember reading years ago, there was a Mossad operation that it infiltrated the supply chain of furniture to one of these installations and managed to get a desk booby-trapped one of the nuclear sites, and that desk exploded with tremendous force and destroyed some significant portion. Does the Mossad have some trick up its sleeve for Fordo? If I'll put it this way, everybody has known for 15 years that, since they've known about Fordo, they've known that step 2 is Fordo.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is entirely possible that that the Israelis have a solution to Fordo. I have no idea what it would be, but we had no idea we had the current capability we have. They've been, again, unprecedented in the history of warfare. A lot of people were talking about how the new war of drones and missiles would make air forces obsolete. The Israelis figured out how the integration of the two is vastly more powerful than either alone. So we're breaking new ground in the history of war, and to believe the Israelis can handle Fordo. If the Americans do it, the Americans take on costs, right? The Iranians will have to launch missiles just for the show of it. After threatening for so many decades, they will have to launch missiles at American troop deployments in the region. Ironically, that might actually bring the Americans in. In other words, even the fear that could happen, or the theory that if something blows up in Fordo and it's Israeli, but the Iranians assume in the first 45 seconds that it's America because they don't think the Israelis can, then they attack American troops in UAE or Qatar. That would bring the American response. And so, it's a delicate question. I completely understand Americans who are saying, I don't want to get in on this. And I fundamentally, almost as a question of identity, believe that Israel has to be able to go it alone. But to take Fordo with Israeli capabilities might involve, assuming we don't have some magical rabbit that the Mossad has already managed to pull out a dozen times in the last 20 months, might involve ground troops and might involve real difficult battle with real casualties for the Israelis, something that good planning has so far avoided. So I don't know to say more than that, but that is the big question everyone is now waiting to hear. I should also say, and this is really a rumor, but these rumors have all turned out to be correct. There's an old joke about Israeli secrets. A KGB spy comes to Tel Aviv to meet with an Israeli connection in the Israeli security services, and he arrives at the apartment and he rings the doorbell, and the guy answers the door and he says, "Can I help you?" And the guy says, "The birds fly south in winter." And the guy says, "Excuse me." The KGB spy says, "The birds fly south in winter." And the guy says, "Oh, no, I'm Goldberg the dentist. You want Goldberg the spy. He's on the same side." Right? It's this idea that everybody knows everything. Ultimately, right, we journalists are required to only report on the Israeli nuclear program from foreign sources that reveal things. But it's not like people don't know, right? And so I have to say that there is now talk in Israel, make of it what you will, that the next 2 days are a significant pivot from what has been up to now. That what has been up to now will continue, the hunt for the launchers will continue, maintaining the launcher bottleneck that has meant 50 missiles in a round instead of 400 will continue, the pursuit of the regime will continue and expand probably to the energy sector, which it's already started doing, but there might be a serious pivot in the coming days. There have been talk about that and a lot of speculation about that in Israel.
And troops on the ground, how would that be accomplished? Is that through Syria? Is that, what is the... the access.
Well,
Luckily,
air?
I don't know anything, so I can talk freely. Israel maintains capabilities that have not made sense in war since the 1950s, have not been used since the 1950s. For example, active paratroopers trained to jump out of airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
The last time an Israeli soldier jumped out of an airplane in a war, combat situation, is 1956 in the Sinai. And it was not a very useful operation then. And yet we have entire units and brigade level units, thousands of men, able and equipped and trained to jump out of airplanes. It is not inconceivable, and this is stuff that's out there on the military blogosphere and things like that. It is not inconceivable that the Israelis have the capabilities to drop significant numbers of troops where they need to in Iran, who can take a region, prepare a landing field there, hold it, and conduct military operations while defending the place in ways that allow them to get into installations like Fordo, things like that. It's utter speculation, the kind of speculation that's been out there in public for decades, but Israel has those capabilities. And so, one of the ways that Israel really shines as a military is in the understanding that war is the realm of the unknown. That's something you learn in your first week in officer school in the IDF. You come to the battlefield with all the best laid plans, and then the enemy surprises you, and that is the nature and definition of the enemy in war. And then you have to improvise. But the most of what you're going to be doing on the battlefield is improvise. By the way, in that sense, what's happened so far has been astonishing. For the enemy to have so easily fallen into all of our plans has been just a miracle and a gift. But the ability to do this, the ability to have wild and crazy kinds of options, redundancies, far more forces than you actually need on paper, is really important once you actually encounter that unknown, that battlefield situation. And so we have that. And I can imagine 6 different ways it could go down just from my being a junior, sergeant in the Israeli infantry 25 years ago. But it is, I think, doable. Very, very dangerous. We're going to lose people in an operation like that. America could do it cleanly without any losses to our side, but America might not want to, and that's okay. Israel can handle things on its own. Israel needs to be able to handle things on its own.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, speaking as an American, it wouldn't seem okay to me. I mean, I just view us as rudderless. This isn't just a criticism of the Trump administration. Arguably, I think that, as you pointed out, Trump, all things considered, has been better for Israel's predicament than we had any reason to expect a Kamala Harris administration would have been, at least with respect to the degree to which she would have been captured by the far left moral confusion that you alluded to early on. But it's just that the clarity of this morally and geopolitically, I think, is impossible to exaggerate. We have a regime in Iran that was sprinting to acquire nuclear capability, and for decades it has advertised its aspiration to use this technology to perpetrate a genocide in the Middle East. Right? I mean, it has been explicit in its chanting death to America at every opportunity. It has been explicit in its aspiration to perpetrate a second Holocaust with the most powerful weapons it can get its hands on, and it's the mad work it's accomplished in supporting all of its proxies and its culpability for October 7th and the depredations of Hezbollah and the Houthis. I mean, it's just the idea that we were going to enter another round of fake negotiation and capitulation to this regime seems just morally insane to me. And in addition to all of that, I don't imagine this would be part of the calculus, but politically, but morally, in addition to all of that, I think we have reason to believe that the Iranian people, unlike many of the other Arab countries where we have meddled over the years, and only to find that they were many people, a majority of the population was still hankering for theocracy, even though to give them democracy. Iran seems like it is properly sick of theocracy. I don't know if that's 60% of the population or 80% of the population.
We don't have any replacement.
Again, you know better than I, but it seems like you have in Iran a population that is just under the cover of hijab imposed silence. You have certainly a population of women itching to live cosmopolitan, reasonably secular lives, and presumably there are many men in their lives who share the same frustration with the last 40 years of life in Iran. So it would unlike some of these other countries where we thought we would be greeted with flowers and we were greeted with at minimum some more ambiguity than that. In Iran, it seems a reasonable bet that most Iranians would be happy to be done with theocracy. Is that your impression of what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, it runs deep. What America encountered in the Middle East was societies whose basic identity structures were very tribal. And I'm not criticizing, by the way. I think that's something that Israelis share with much of the rest of the Middle East in ways that make them a little bit strangers in the West, where being Sunni or being Shia in Iraq was not a theological difference between Sunni and Shia, I don't know what mystical traditions. It was a tribe. It was literally clans and groups and places that you live who fight together and will defend you. That is still a wild west. And America didn't understand why they weren't all rushing to the banner of the great ideas of the Western Enlightenment. I don't know how to put this. I'm a big fan of the big ideas of the Western Enlightenment, and I thank God every day I have a tribe. There's some complex mixing of the two that produces the healthiest, happiest society. For example, frankly, forgive me for the flag waving here, but Israelis have all of the freedoms, the gay pride parades and the self-expressions and the religious diversities of the liberal West, and they all and the high birth rates, including among secular, high-tech engineers in Israel have higher birth rates than the entirety of the rest of the developed world. And every other kind of Israeli has higher birth rates than them. And so we have that mix. And America encountered this thing that I think American culture didn't really know how to comprehend, how to deal with. It wrote a beautiful constitution for Iraq without contending with this deep complexity of
existential threat brings solidarity.
In Iran, you have a completely different story. You very much have ethnic tribes and religious tribalism and all of that, but you have a regime with a story that is essentially fundamentally a deep betrayal of the very revolution that brought it to power. Iran's revolution has two parts, and I say this not to tell people the history, but to invite people to fact check me so that they begin this journey into the history, because this really matters to understanding what's going to happen going forward. The Iranian Revolution, the Shah of 1978, before the revolution, was pro-American in the Cold War, but very much a tyrant with a secret police and abusive and oppressive. And the revolution that sparked in 1978 in December was a revolution that allied all the different elements of Iranian society, all of them, from the clerical religious movements and mosques and charities of that Islamist world of Khomeini, to the liberals, the liberal nationalists, the feminists, the various communist groups that all fought against each other, obviously, the students, the wealthy, the poor, the bazaar merchants, the small shopkeepers, all these different elements of Iranian society came out to march in this revolution against the Shah. And what was amazing, millions of people marching over 2 days all over Iran. Something like 15% of the population of the country all turned out. In Tehran itself, it was something like 2.5 million people, half the city marched. And within 6 weeks, the Shah was gone. And 2 weeks after he was gone, Khomeini came back from exile. And what would then happen over the course of 1979, and then over the course of the next 9 years, was the slow removal from that coalition, almost always violently, of all those other elements of Iranian society as the religious factions consolidated power in this new government. So the promise of democracy, as all those marchers marched, you had banners. People should look up these marches from the Ashura rebellion, that's the holiday it happened on, of 1978. There were people marching with banners about democracy and liberalism and elections and rights of women. And the religious clerics were the most organized of all these oppositions, of all these social subgroups, because they had networks that the Shah had a hard time suppressing. You could easily suppress student groups on campus. You had a very hard time suppressing what a cleric would say, an imam would say in a mosque on at a Friday prayer. And so they were the best organized and the best ready to take advantage, and they turned into an incredibly brutal theocracy. They pushed the Marxists to the point where many were killed, many fled to Iraq, to the Shia Arabs of Iraq, and in the Iran-Iraq war actually joined Hamas is a Freudian slip of an Israeli nowadays, joined Saddam's war on Iran, and so were seen as traitors by Iran. And in 1988, the regime actually went through the prisons of Iran and murdered all the people they thought, over 5,000 people, belonged to these Marxist groups over the border in that war. And so just a series of crackdowns and murders, the shuttering of universities, the firing en masse of all secular university lecturers. This regime came to power in one of the most beautiful moments in the history of this nation, this competent and diverse and fascinating nation. And the first thing it did, and everything it did from that day one, was the rejection and dismantling of all of the promise of a potential, multi-party, multi-vision kind of parliamentarism that Iran could have been. And since then, 46 years, there have been only two supreme leaders, Khomeini and Ali Khamenei, who is still the supreme leader now, as long as he's still alive.
Doesn't matter.
And that regime has basically managed to drive Iran into the dirt over those 46 years. The only success it has had in 46 years, the only accomplishment Iranian society can point to, is the regime sufficiently oppressing, sufficiently co-opting different elites to stay in power. So every poll we have, the polls published in state media of the regime, tell the same fundamental story as polls coming in from outside. The vast majority of Iranians, probably 90%, want the regime gone. It as disaffection with the economic problems. In the moment when the war began, Iran was facing mass trucker strikes, mass nurse strikes, mass strikes of bakeries, all kinds of pieces of the economy. It just went through a terrible winter without access to gas. It's one of the most gas-rich countries in the world. One of the phrases that Iranians often talk about, especially the Iranian diaspora, is the tragedy of a very poor nation living in a very rich country. And that's the story of this regime. So they hate it profoundly. And the tribalism matters because the whole point that brought them to power was this unity that they then cracked down on and turned into this running two-generation-long catastrophe.
So is it your understanding that Israel in its strikes so far has stopped short of trying to engineer the fall of the regime? Have they not been attacking the theocratic ruling targets?
It's such a complex question and such an important one. I the Israelis would love for the regime to fall, to solve all the problems in one fell swoop. There are plenty of governments out there that don't like us, but also aren't massive, immediate, catastrophic dangers to us, because they're not this particular kind of regime. So, if Iran was run like Turkey, it would not seek nukes, because it would be too busy building a serious economy. Now, Turkey might be headed in a more Islamist direction. Turkey is certainly headed in a more Islamist direction, but it's coming from a place of real democratic, open tradition. There's still elections, there's still local elections. Erdogan occasionally arrests his leading opposition leader. but there's enough democracy there that there's still a kind of competence and a need to actually take care of what the people actually need and not literally rob them blind at a mass scale over generations to build a nuke that nobody understands why you need. So if Iran were a regime of the style of Turkey, I don't need it to be Switzerland, it would already not be a danger to Israel in any way. And so regime change is a shortcut. It's a wonderful idea. Let's do it. That's great. I'm for it. The problem is nobody quite knows how. And America is very scared of regime change because it's failed repeatedly. Israel is not even able to imagine itself in a league where this is any kind of option, right? We have the population of Austria. We are not going to now go into this country 9 times our population and many more times our size geographically and somehow re-engineer Iranian political society and consciousness into a new regime. So
we don't think that the thirst for a new government coming from the Iranian people themselves
Sweetie, thirst wouldn't do it. You need water.
Coup in the aftermath of some decapitation strike from Israel?
They've spent 46 years doing nothing but figuring out how to prevent that from happening. And they have degraded the organizing capacity of every single power base in Iranian society to the point where it may not be doable. But the hope is that we meet in the middle. The hope is that we degrade that political elite and ruling elite and the IRGC and also the elements of the regime that are not turned against us, that are turned against their own people, like this thing called the Basij, which is this immense, it's a bunch of thugs who go to the streets to beat up protesters en masse, but it's enormous and it has intelligence services, it's a kind of its own police as well. Can we degrade these institutions sufficiently to seriously open a window for courage to come forth and actually organize and take down the regime? The simple answer is, I don't know. We're going to degrade them as far as we have to be able to take out the things that threaten us, the missile production facilities and the nuclear program, and the people will have to make a choice. Now, they've been under this thing for 46 years. Nobody doubts what the people want. There's simply there's a debate over whether it's 75% or 91%. There's no debate about what the people want. And but the people will have to seize it on their own. We're not America, and we're a small people with tremendous strengths, and thankfully Iran is tremendously incompetent as a state. But that's the best I can do. Gosh, I hope so. But Iranians are going to have to do it.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's pivot to the war in Gaza and this long-standing fact that Israel is really is I forget who coined this line, but it has been treated as the Jew among nations for as long as it has been a nation. Well, let's take that piece first. I mean, I want to talk about the war in Gaza and what you expect there, but it seems to me that Israel has completely lost, I don't think that's putting it too strongly, an information war with the rest of the world. I mean, there's something about a failure of public relations here that is proving catastrophic, not just to Israel and its standing in the world, but to the perception of Jews outside of Israel at this moment. We've seen this explosion of anti-Semitism globally. To some degree, the war in Gaza is one can imagine a pretext to express something, an ambient level of anti-Semitism that's already there.
Yeah.
But I think in other contexts, it is creating an animus toward Jews that certainly in people where you wouldn't expect it. So we just have this larger global problem of the greatest efflorescence of anti-Semitism we've seen in our lifetime, and Israel's status, virtual status as a pariah nation among nations that really should know better. I mean, because again, the moral asymmetries here between Israel and her enemies, and we'll get into them, are beyond obvious, right? This is not a hard call, and yet everything is upside down, and crucially, everything was upside down not just in response to Israel's invasion of Gaza. But prior to that, before,
Yes.
I mean, this is how we can dissect the level of moral confusion suffered by most of the
Or
free world.
enjoyed by.
On October 8th, before Israel had responded, you had
They're
our most
enjoying
elite
it. We're the
institutions
ones suffering.
effectively taking the side of Hamas. In certain cases, explicitly taking the side of Hamas. So, how did we get here? Right. Again, we'll get into the details of Gaza. We'll get into many of the lies, truths that anchor people to this confusion. But how is it that this war, this information war, seems to have been lost up until this point?
There's so much to say. It's hard to know when to start. Where to begin? I would say, first of all, the projection of one's anxieties and concerns about the war in Gaza onto your local Jewish community is
As if
such
they can
obvious
do
rabid
something.
bigotry
Yeah.
that and nobody in the West would be confused on this question if you applied it to Muslims or if you applied it to Hindus.
Or the Chinese?
India,
I don't see
or the
Chinese
Chinese.
Americans being blamed for the behavior of the CCP.
Right, and so there's just no. It's just and maybe China doesn't claim to represent all Chinese, but there are plenty of Muslim states doing plenty of horrific things at scales an order of magnitude larger than Gaza. In the worst case scenario that you believe of Israel in Gaza, that claim to represent Islam, and nobody comes to the Muslim community in America or in Britain, Canada, and says to them, explain yourselves. So no, none of that is legitimate in any way. It's just an anti-Semitism that is permissible in elite circles because it has a cachet in Western civilization, given to Western civilization, an inheritance of the Christian tradition that makes it okay, makes it recognizable, and therefore not something that feels dangerous and upsetting. So I don't have to respect that even slightly. I don't have to respect that at all. Israel will commit crimes. Israel will make mistakes. I've never sat in a room with Americans and said to them, America makes terrible mistakes and sometimes real crimes, and had any American ever fall off their chair. Not a single one, no matter how patriotic they are. Israel's a real country, and it's going to make those mistakes. And if you then come to your Jewish community in Cleveland, Ohio, with complaints, you are the bigot, and there's nothing else to know about that situation. So that's the first point. The second point is a lot of it, he said, immediately after saying the first thing. Israel's fault is one of the most beautiful things about us is one of the most catastrophic things in wartime. And that is that we are a people culturally profoundly incapable of explaining ourselves. And it comes from a very deep and very old place. In the late 19th century, the pogroms begin. There's a specific moment, the death of Tsar Alexander II at the hand of anarchist assassins in 1881 in St. Petersburg. He was this reformist Tsar who abolished serfdom and was this guy that many Jews hoped would deliver for the Jews, would end the Pale of Settlements, would end the anti-Semitic laws of the Russian Empire. And when he dies, his reactionary son, Alexander III, takes over. This is 1881. And one of his first acts is to pass massively anti-Semitic laws that tighten the regime of restrictions on Jewish lives in the empire, the May laws of 1882. Mm-hmm. And that's when we see the beginning of what would be 40 years and more of mass pogroms. That would become something like 1,300 pogroms. It would begin...
Which Menachem Begin also experienced.
They escalate in number and in deadliness over the course of the next 40 years. Probably killing over those 4 decades 250,000 Jews, including in World War I and the Russian Civil War, unrelated to the war itself, just villages burned to the ground.
Yeah.
And that drove millions and millions of Jews to flight, millions of Jews to leave. And right at that period, you begin to see a serious consolidation of what would come to be known as the Zionist movement. And it literally begins, people can look up a guy named Leo Pinsker, who is a Russian integrationist, infatuated with this reformist Tsar. And there's the sudden pivot after his death to mass pogroms. And he says, wait a second. The day, by the way, of the Tsar's assassination, that morning he gave the order to establish a parliament for the Russian Empire. He wanted to lead the Russian Empire to what the rest of Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe was becoming. And he says, wait a minute, what if we're living a fantasy? What if this new modernity and liberalism and science and people are discovering electrons and whatever, what if all of this is actually a veneer overlaying a much, much more real trend of consolidation identities, of industrialization that was driving people from small places, villages, farms into big cities, and creating these new mass societies and mass identities and radicalized political movements. And all of this stuff, all of these changes would turn on the Jews and turn on the minorities, and we're actually not safe anymore. And there's this entire sociological analysis of modernization that develops that is basically Herzlian Zionism. Mm-hmm. And Pinsker writes a pamphlet in 1881 called Auto-Emancipation, meaning the emancipation is a series of laws passed by these European countries in the late 19th century that liberate the Jews from the ghettos, liberate the Jews from the restrictions on university and professions and all of that. And he says, what if it's all not real? What if none of this emancipation ultimately will end well? You have to auto-emancipate yourself. That's the only solution. Jews need self-determination. And one of the main arguments that these early Zionists make, these strategic Zionists who awaken because of this sudden turn of Europe on the Jews, is the idea that a Jew cannot stand before the anti-Semite and explain himself. Mm-hmm. Now, they thought of an anti-Semite as someone to whom the Jew is some kind of moral cartoon, some kind of antagonist or protagonist, and some kind of morality play happening in their own head. In other words, not a human being in front of them, but part of the story they need for their own definition of themselves. That's an anti-Semite. And when you stand before that anti-Semite and you say, oh no, I'm not this thing you think I am, I'm actually over here, this other thing, this complex, three-dimensional human thing, you cannot, these thinkers, the Pinskers and the Herzls say, you cannot penetrate the fog of their morality plane. And because you cannot penetrate that fog, you will stand before them and you will try to explain, and you will end up trying to justify. And justifying yourself is dehumanizing. And so you are forbidden to justify yourself. That is not a thing that a Jew with dignity and basic human dignity is permitted to do anymore. And yes. The Zionist movement creates a foundational culture of not justifying yourself. And you have this in the 1950s, David Ben-Gurion in the UN would say something mean to Israel, that Ben-Gurion would say, shmum, which means UN shmun, right? Mm-hmm. The Yiddishism of saying, who cares about the UN? Mm-hmm. On October 15th, 2023, a week after the war began, a week after October 7th, Israel had a Ministry of Public Diplomacy. Call it propaganda, call it... It's a ministry with that title on the door. And it had founded the Ministry of Public Diplomacy 5 times over the course of its existence, and it keeps shutting it down because it doesn't know what to do with it. And the Minister of Public Diplomacy, a member of Knesset belonging to Netanyahu's Likud party, got up on television and said to Israelis, this is again a week into the war, maybe 10 days into the war, and says to Israelis, look, this is a fake ministry, it's not a real thing. In coalition negotiations, you establish fake ministries to make it easier to hand out, positions to people so the negotiations go easier. I don't mind wasting public funds to make coalition talks easier in peacetime, but I'm not going to waste public funds in wartime. Mm-hmm. And she resigned right there on national television. Mm-hmm. And she shut down her ministry. And it was the most patriotic thing she had ever done. And so just to recap, Israel shut down its public diplomacy ministry because a war started. Is how bad Israelis at a fundamental cultural level are, at the understanding that they have to stand before the world is going on. In 20 months of war, Netanyahu has not appointed a serious, proper spokesman that anybody else had to go to.
That's our job in the diaspora, I believe.
It was the BBC a couple of weeks ago that 14,000 babies were going to die within 48 hours. Yeah. Maybe it was a slip of the tongue. It took him an awfully long time to issue a correction. It was such a patent falsehood that it was just not humanly possible for that to be even within 3 orders of magnitude of possibility. Even if you hate Israel and wish Israel were destroyed, that still should have actually rung out to you as an obvious lie. But when journalists came looking, there wasn't an Israeli spokesperson they could have called. There just isn't one in government. And they never bothered to establish them. And so this is a world, an entire arena of war that for Hamas is central to their strategy. And for all of its allies is central to their strategy. And the Israelis, because of this cultural kink, we do not stand before the world and justify ourselves. I love this about Israelis. And it is a massive strategic liability at wartime. And that's basically the story. So we can't. By the way, you can get Israelis to take PR seriously if you tell them it hurts the Jews. In other words, you Israelis, great, you don't have to live with these people over in, I don't know what, Denver or London. But the Jews of the diaspora do, and you're hurting them by allowing whatever the most right-wing, rabid politician says about emptying Gaza to be the only Israeli voice out there in the world, and not the voice of the 80% mainstream of Israeli Jews. And then, I know we should probably do this, but they still don't have the basic cultural sense that this is. So a country with the competence on display over the skies of Iran can't, and by the way, Netanyahu, when he wants to win the next election, is going to hire the best marketing firm that knows how to hack the human brainstem. But they're not going to do it to justify themselves. They can't do it physically. It's a thing that is extremely difficult for an Israeli to undertake culturally.
Yeah, that's a fascinating answer, and one that I had never heard before.
Well, you should listen to Habib more.
Okay, well, so you talk rather often about understanding people and tribes in all their complexity, and not defaulting to the cartoon in your head. I would argue that the situation, the moral asymmetry to which I just alluded, is about as the real situation is about as cartoonish as disparities in human motives and cultural qualities ever get. And so I'll just put this to you, and none of this is going to be novel to you, but I just want you to, defrag my hard drive if you think there's any way in which I have this wrong, because, it's not often that I'm speaking to someone who is as informed as you are about the details of life on the ground there. But I think it sounds absolutely cartoonish to say, and I forget where this point originates, but it sounds like wartime propaganda to say if the Palestinians simply laid down their arms, there would be peace in the region. If the Israelis laid down their arms, there would be a genocide. Right? That sounds insane. I think certainly to a first approximation, something like that is true and has been true for as long as Israel has existed. I mean, perhaps just react to that. But for me, that asymmetry is almost in crystalline form all that I think you need to understand about the predicament in the Middle East.
I know something about your podcast and your audience, and they're expecting rich depth, which I'm going to, so I'm struggling to deliver here.
But also what I'm expecting, what I'm urging you to do is to please, if there's anything if there's any crucial nuance that you think I'm eliding by putting it that starkly, I really want to hear it.
It's absolutely that stark. That is exactly the truth. It is a simple truth. It is an accurate truth. The parts of the Arab and Muslim world that are allied with us, not all of them, not the Emiratis, but quite a few of them. Certainly, I think the Egyptians would not beat around the bush and just admitting it. The day we lay down our arms and for some reason are incapable of lifting them back up again and punishing anyone who takes advantage of that moment is the day that a great many Middle Easterners find their courage and come marching in and destroying us. But the nuance I want to add to that, and you will not find an honest, over in the diaspora, among sort of diaspora, I don't know what, professors of some of these nations, you will find people, pretending that they come from these deeply liberal societies and depicting their societies in ways that no one on the ground in their societies would recognize. But there's a depth there. It is not animalistic animus. It is something profound. People live, this is my methodological sort of bottom line. I developed it as a political journalist. People live in stories. People live in narratives of where they come from, where they're going, what's happening to them. And if you understand those stories, and those stories are always complex and rich and fascinating and produce contradictions within the minds of people, and contradictions built into the stories, and they don't feel like contradictions to the people themselves, or they're willing to live with these contradictions because reality is big and complex. And so real people live in these real profound contradictions. The stories that are told about us in the Arab world and the stories that are told about us in the larger Muslim world are stories that have very little to do with us and a lot to do with how Arabs and Muslims understand what has happened to them. And it's a story that I could send people to a podcast episode of mine because we really lay out the theological, lineage of 5 generations of theologians that produced Hamas. But this lineage begins in the middle of the 19th century with these Egyptian theologians or Syrian theologians who moved to Egypt. It begins in Egypt. And it begins in Egypt because Egypt comes under British rule in the middle of the 19th century. And the disparity, as the Ottoman Empire is imploding slowly, but everyone understands